I worked alone at a flood control facility because no one else wanted the overnight shifts, and after a few years of contract security jobs, I'd learned that isolation paid better than comfort. My name is Marcus Webb, I'm 28, and at the time I took the job I was coming off a stretch of warehouse and substation work that blurred together into long nights, bad coffee, and logs no one ever read. The facility sat inland from the coast, wedged between a river delta and a stretch of low-lying marsh that had flooded badly during storms a decade earlier. Officially, the place existed to prevent that from happening again. A network of sluice gates, pumps, and retention basins designed to keep water where it belonged. On paper, it was boring. In person, it felt like something built in a hurry, like the engineers had been racing a deadline they didn't fully understand. The first thing I noticed when I arrived for my initial overnight was how quiet it was. Not peaceful quiet, empty quiet. The kind where sound feels swallowed before it can echo. I parked beside the main control building just before sunset, black hoodie zipped up against the damp air, dark jeans stiff from dried mud, steel-toe boots crunching on gravel that hadn't been turned over in years. The river sat beyond the levee to the east, a wide, slow-moving sheet of dark water reflecting the sky, while the retention basins to the west were flat and still, segmented by concrete walls that looked too thin for their purpose. Inside, the control room smelled faintly of ozone and old water. Banks of monitors lined one wall, most of them displaying static camera feeds of gates and channels that rarely changed. A man named Collins was finishing the day shift. Middle-aged, exhausted, with the look of someone who'd stopped asking questions a long time ago. He handed me the keys, walked me through the basics, then hesitated before leaving, fingers tapping the edge of the console like he was trying to decide something. Finally, he reached into a drawer and slid a folded paper toward me. "These are the alert protocols," he said. "Not the standard ones, the real ones." I unfolded it. No letterhead, just bullet points. If sirens activate without weather alerts, remain inside. Do not access exterior walkways during unscheduled alarms. If you hear voices through the siren system, log time and content only. Do not respond. Do not attempt manual override unless directed. I looked up and asked him why the sirens would activate without a storm. Collins didn't meet my eyes. "They shouldn't," he said, then picked up his bag and left without another word. Night settled in fast after that. Fog crept up from the river and marsh, wrapping the facility in a damp gray that blurred the perimeter lights into dull halos. My first few hours passed quietly. I ran system checks, logged normal readings, watched camera feeds where nothing moved but water and the occasional ripple of wind through reeds. Around 10, I noticed the first oddity. One of the retention basin cameras showed a water level that didn't match the sensor data. The gauge read stable. The image showed the water creeping higher against the concrete wall. I told myself it was an old camera, warped perspective, logged it and moved on. By 11, two more feeds showed the same discrepancy. The water wasn't surging. It wasn't flowing. It was simply closer, like it had inched forward when no one was looking. I stood from the console and leaned closer to the monitors, feeling that faint pressure behind my eyes that I'd started associating with places like this, sites where infrastructure sat between people and things they didn't fully control. At 11:47 p.m., the sirens activated. No warning. No buildup. 1 second the room was quiet, the next it was filled with that rising, hollow wail meant to cut through wind and rain and panic. I froze, heart slamming against my ribs, eyes snapping to the weather monitor. Clear, no storm cells, no pressure drops, no alerts from upstream stations. The siren shouldn't have been possible. I reached for the radio, then stopped, remembering the protocol sheet. Remain inside. I stayed where I was, hands hovering uselessly over the console, listening as the siren cycled through its warning pattern. And then something changed. Underneath the mechanical wail, I heard something else. A distortion in the sound, subtle at first, like feedback. Then words began to surface, stretched thin by speakers never meant for speech. "Gate S not holding," a voice said, buried in the siren's rise and fall. It sounded calm, professional, like a status update. Another voice followed, overlapping slightly. That's fine, let it equalize. My mouth went dry. The siren system wasn't connected to any intercom. There was no way for voices to come through it. I glanced at the exterior cameras. On 3 separate feeds, I watched water slip over concrete lips it hadn't reached minutes earlier, spilling into channels that were supposed to stay dry unless manually opened. The siren kept wailing, and beneath it, the voices continued, discussing levels and flow like they were standing out there watching the same impossible thing I was. I logged the time with shaking hands, every instinct screaming at me to shut the system down, to do something, anything, but the protocol sheet sat heavy in my pocket, its words clear and final. Do not respond. Do not override. I stayed inside the control room while the sirens howled into the fog, realizing with a slow, creeping dread that whatever triggered them wasn't reacting to a storm. It was reacting to the water deciding it had waited long enough. The sirens ran for 12 minutes straight before cutting off as abruptly as they'd started, leaving a ringing silence that made my ears ache and my hands tremble. I stayed seated for a full minute afterward, staring at the monitors, waiting for something else to happen, some follow-up alert or automated message that would explain what I just heard. Nothing came. The weather feed still showed clear skies upstream. The river gauge remained within normal parameters, and yet 3 retention basins on the west side were now visibly fuller than they'd been at the start of my shift. Dark water pressed tight against concrete walls that were never meant to hold pressure without warning. I logged the siren event exactly as the protocol sheet instructed, writing down the time and the fragments of speech I'd heard beneath the alarm, my handwriting uneven despite my effort to keep it neat. Once I finished, I sat back and tried to rationalize it. Crossed signals, malfunctioning speakers, old wiring picking up interference from somewhere else. That explanation fell apart the moment I rewound the camera footage from just before the sirens activated. On the feeds, the water didn't rush or surge. It didn't behave like a system under stress. It simply advanced, one smooth increment at a time, like a boundary being politely redrawn. Around 1 in the morning, I noticed something else. The exterior cameras were no longer syncing properly. Feeds that should have been near identical, adjacent channels, parallel gates, were now showing slightly different versions of the same space. In one, the water sat just below a spillway lip. In another, it was already flowing over. The timestamps matched. The angles matched. Reality didn't. I stood up and walked closer to the monitors, that pressure building again behind my eyes, the sensation that the room itself was paying attention to me now. When I leaned in, the speakers crackled softly, not enough to register as sound, just a faint electrical hiss that made my skin crawl. I stepped back, heart pounding, and the hiss faded. I remembered Collins's hesitation, the way he'd said the real ones when he handed me the protocol sheet. This wasn't the first time the sirens had gone off without a storm. It was just the first time they'd done it on my watch. At 1:34 a.m., the sirens activated again, shorter this time. 2 long wails, then silence. No voices underneath, just the raw mechanical sound tearing through the fog. I didn't move. I didn't reach for the controls. I stayed exactly where I was and logged it when it ended. Outside, on the cameras, I saw something that made my stomach drop. The perimeter lights along the western fence line were reflecting off water that hadn't been there an hour earlier. The retention basin had overflowed into a service corridor without triggering any alarms beyond the sirens themselves. According to the system, nothing was wrong. According to my eyes, the facility was slowly filling from the wrong direction. I considered calling Collins, then stopped. The protocol didn't forbid calls, but something told me it wouldn't matter. Whoever was meant to respond to this already knew. By 2, the fog had thickened enough that the exterior cameras lost depth entirely. Everything beyond the first few feet of concrete blurred into gray, and the water reflected that gray back up at the lenses, erasing edges and making it impossible to tell where structures ended and channels began. That was when I heard movement through the speakers again. Not voices this time, not words. Just the sound of water shifting through narrow spaces, amplified and distorted, like something heavy adjusting itself inside pipes that were never designed for it. The sound followed a pattern, moving from one speaker to the next in sequence, tracing the layout of the facility with unsettling precision. I found myself holding my breath, listening, as if responding might somehow acknowledge whatever was using the system as a mouthpiece. At 2:17 a.m., one of the gate indicators flipped from green to amber without any corresponding command. The gate itself didn't move. The light just changed, like the system was considering the possibility. Beneath the indicator, a message blinked briefly on the console before disappearing. Equalization pending. I stared at the spot where it had been, my pulse loud in my ears. Equalization wasn't an emergency term. It was something engineers used when two sides of a system were meant to meet in the middle. I checked the manual. There was no mention of it in relation to unscheduled events. When the sirens activated a third time just before 3, they didn't wail. They spoke. The alarm tone rose, fell, and then flattened into a carrier sound, and a voice came through clearly enough that there was no mistaking it. Pressure differential is acceptable, it said. Calm, neutral, not asking permission. Proceed. My hands shook so badly I had to grip the edge of the console to steady myself. The voice didn't sound like Collins. It didn't sound like anyone I knew. It sounded like it belonged there, like the siren system had always been intended for this, and alarms were just a secondary function. On the monitors, I watched as two gates opened a few inches on their own, just enough to let water begin threading through into channels that led inland. No alarms triggered. No overrides engaged. The system treated it as a correction. I thought about breaking protocol, about hitting the manual stop, about doing something, but the pressure behind my eyes intensified until it felt like my skull was being gently squeezed, a warning without pain. I froze, fear and instinct at war, and did the only thing the rules allowed. I logged it. When dawn finally crept in, pale and weak through the fog, the sirens were silent, the gates sat partially open, and the water levels had stabilized at new, higher baselines that the system now accepted as normal. When Collins arrived for the morning shift, he took one look at the monitors and went very still. "It talked to you, didn't it?" he said quietly. I nodded. He exhaled slowly and reached for the logbook. "Then it's moved on from testing," he said. "Tonight," he added, not meeting my eyes, "you won't be alone anymore." They brought the others in before sunset, 4 men total, all of them quiet, all of them dressed like they belonged to different departments but moved with the same practiced economy, like they'd been trained together and then scattered. No names were offered beyond first names that felt deliberately generic, and no one shook my hand. Collins didn't introduce me either, just pointed at the console and said, "He was on duty when it spoke." That earned me a long look from the oldest of the group, a man with close-cropped gray hair and eyes that never quite focused on faces, always drifting to the room itself, the walls, the ceiling, the monitors, like he was gauging how much the space was paying attention. They shut the control room doors and killed all external audio feeds, plunging the facility into a padded silence that made every hum and relay click sound too loud. One of them pulled a slim black binder from his bag and set it on the table between us. The cover was unmarked, but the first page inside was. Project Equal Tide was stamped across it in block letters, followed by a classification level I didn't recognize. He flipped past diagrams of the facility that didn't match the schematics I'd been trained on, showing additional channels and subsurface chambers that were never mentioned in the public documentation. "This site isn't just flood control," he said, finally speaking directly to me. "It's a mediation structure." That word again. Mediation. Like this was a disagreement, not a catastrophe. He explained it clinically, like he'd done it 100 times before. Certain regions, especially deltas and reclaimed wetlands, exhibited what the project referred to as boundary instability, a tendency for water to disregard established limits when observed, measured, or aggressively managed. The sirens weren't alarms in the traditional sense. They were interfaces. When activated without weather triggers, it meant the system had detected a negotiation attempt from the water side. "It's not conscious the way you are," he said, anticipating my unspoken question. "But it responds to pressure, attention, and certainty. You confirm a boundary too firmly, it pushes. You deny it, it searches elsewhere. I asked him about the voices. His expression tightened just slightly. That's a recent development, he said. It means equalization is no longer theoretical. They showed me archived footage from other facilities, other flood control sites and barriers that had failed quietly over the years, all labeled as engineering miscalculations or extreme weather events. In every case, there were gaps in the data, moments where readings flattened out or contradicted visual evidence. In one clip, I watched a night guard walk along a channel, stop, lean closer to the water, and then simply step forward, vanishing into a surface that should have been shallow. The report listed it as a slip-and-fall fatality. Why keep these places running at all? I asked, my voice sounding distant even to me. The gray-haired man closed the binder. Because without mediation, he said, the adjustments would be abrupt, catastrophic. These facilities don't stop the water, they teach it where to go slowly. As if on cue, the sirens activated again, this time at a lower volume, a controlled pulse rather than a wail. The men went still. On the monitors, I watched as the water levels across multiple basins shifted simultaneously, not rising, not falling, just redistributing themselves into a configuration that matched one of the diagrams I'd glimpsed in the binder. It's responding to the increased presence, one of them murmured. Too many observers. They ordered us out of the control room, leaving the systems to run autonomously while they set up additional equipment in the auxiliary building. As I stepped into the corridor, I felt that familiar pressure behind my eyes intensify, sharper now, like a warning flare. The sirens pulsed again, and this time the voice came through every speaker in the facility, clear and unmistakable. Flow accepted, it said. Boundary acknowledged. One of the men swore under his breath. Before anyone could react, a shout echoed from outside, cut off abruptly. We ran to the nearest camera feed in time to see one of the perimeter technicians standing ankle-deep in water that hadn't been there seconds earlier, staring down in confusion as the surface around his boots darkened and spread. He took a step back, slipped, and the water surged up around his knees, then his waist, moving far faster than it should have been able to. He screamed once before the feed cut to static. No splash, no struggle, just absence. The sirens fell silent immediately after, like a satisfied breath being released. The room was dead quiet. The gray-haired man closed his eyes for a moment, then straightened. Log it as a breach casualty, he said. Environmental. Someone else asked if we should shut the system down. He shook his head. If we disengage now, he said, it won't negotiate. It'll correct. That night, as they sealed off the flooded section and rewrote the incident report in language that stripped it of meaning, I understood the truth they hadn't said out loud. Project Equal Tide wasn't about protecting land from water. It was about deciding who got taken when the balance had to be restored. And the sirens weren't warnings. They were announcements. By the time night fully set in, the facility no longer felt like a place that was failing so much as one that had already made its decision and was waiting for the paperwork to catch up. And the men from Project Equal Tide moved through it with the calm efficiency of people who knew resistance was pointless. The flooded corridor was sealed off with temporary bulkheads, cameras rerouted, logs amended in real time to turn a living man into a line item, and I was told in a flat, rehearsed tone that I would remain on site until the system reached post-adjustment stability. A phrase that meant nothing until I saw the water begin to move again. Not surging, not flooding, but redistributing itself through channels and basins with deliberate purpose, like it was solving a puzzle only it could see. The sirens pulsed softly every 20 minutes now, not alarms but markers, and each time they did, the pressure behind my eyes sharpened until I felt nauseous, my thoughts slipping just enough that the idea of stepping outside to check things felt reasonable, even necessary, like unfinished work tugging at the back of my skull. One of the men caught me halfway to the door after the second pulse, gripping my arm hard enough to hurt and whispering, "Don't let it complete the circuit," before steering me back to the console. That was when I understood the plan, or at least the shape of it. The system needed a final equalization, a release to settle the imbalance it had been negotiating toward all night, and the easiest way to do that was to let the water take someone who was already paying attention, someone already connected to the boundary by observation and acknowledgement, someone like the technician who'd vanished earlier, someone like me. I decided then that I wasn't staying until that happened. The escape plan wasn't complicated, just desperate. During the chaos of a siren pulse, when the observers clustered around their instruments and the system focused inward, I slipped into the auxiliary maintenance wing, boots splashing through shallow water that shouldn't have been there yet, following a service map I'd memorized during quieter shifts. The farther I went, the louder the sound of moving water became, not rushing but sliding through concrete arteries with a wet, muscular insistence. And beneath it I heard the voice again, not through speakers this time but everywhere, resonating through walls and pipes and the floor itself, calmly stating, "Flow incomplete." I reached the emergency egress tunnel just as another siren pulse hit, the sound flattening into that carrier tone that made my vision blur, and I fumbled the release with shaking hands until it finally gave, the heavy door swinging open to reveal a narrow concrete passage sloping upward toward the surface. I didn't make it 3 steps before something shifted behind me, a sudden increase in pressure that knocked me forward onto my hands, water surging past my boots and wrapping around my ankles like fingers testing grip. I scrambled, steel-toe boots scraping for purchase as the tunnel filled faster than physics allowed, the water dark and cold and heavy with intent, and I heard one of the observers shout my name from somewhere behind the bulkhead, his voice sharp with a fear I hadn't seen in him before. "Stop," he yelled. "You're making it worse." He was right, and that was the worst part. The harder I fought, the more certain the pull became, like the system recognizing my resistance as confirmation that I was the correct variable to remove. The voice softened then, close and intimate, speaking from the water itself as it climbed my legs. "Equalization requires release," it said. "You are already here." I felt the pressure spike behind my eyes until stars burst across my vision, a warning that had become an ultimatum, and for a terrifying moment I considered letting go, letting the water take me the way it had taken the technician, quietly, efficiently, turning me into a corrected data point. What stopped me was the sound of metal screaming as one of the bulkheads failed behind us, a sudden violent rush that tore through the corridor and swept one of the project men off his feet, slamming him into the wall hard enough that he went limp before the water dragged him under, his body vanishing into a side channel that shouldn't have connected to anything. The system reacted instantly, sirens cutting out mid-pulse, the voice falling silent as the pressure eased just enough for me to move again. I didn't wait. I crawled, then stumbled, then ran up the tunnel as fast as my legs would carry me, lungs burning, heart hammering, the water receding behind me with reluctant slowness like it had lost interest. I burst out into the open air near the eastern levee, collapsing onto damp grass under a sky gone pale with approaching dawn, the facility behind me settling into a new, ominous quiet. By the time I dragged myself to my feet, soaked, shaking, and alive, the sirens were silent, the water levels stable at their new baselines, and the remaining observers were already on their phones, voices low and controlled as they began rewriting the night into something that would fit on a report. No one came after me. No one tried to stop me as I walked away along the levee road, because the system had what it needed now, and I was no longer the closest solution. 6 months later, the flood control facility is listed as permanently offline, its failure attributed to a compound infrastructure stress event coinciding with undocumented groundwater shifts, which is the kind of sentence that sounds technical enough to stop questions while saying absolutely nothing. And if you try to look up Project Equal Tide, you won't find a single public reference to it. Not in budgets, not in environmental reviews, not even in conspiracy forums. Like it was never a project at all, but a temporary agreement that expired the moment it served its purpose. I didn't go back to security after that night, didn't renew my certifications, didn't take the calls that came in from the same contractors who'd always paid on time and never asked questions. Because once you understand that some systems aren't built to protect people, but to decide which people get removed to keep everything else stable, it's hard to stand between a line and whatever wants to cross it without wondering when you'll become the easiest variable to erase. I moved inland, took a maintenance job that kept me busy during daylight hours, but the nights didn't get quieter, and neither did my thoughts. Water sounds followed me everywhere, in pipes, in drains, in the low hiss of sprinklers turning on after dark. And sometimes, if I was exhausted enough, I could almost hear the cadence of speech hidden in the flow, calm and procedural, like status updates meant for systems rather than ears. About 3 months after I escaped, I received an email from an address made entirely of numbers. No subject line, no signature, just a single attached document labeled Post-Adjustment Summary. I opened it before I could talk myself out of it, and found a brief report describing the incident at the facility, including the technician's death and the observer lost during containment escalation, both categorized as necessary losses incurred during boundary stabilization, followed by a concluding line that made my stomach turn. Equalization achieved. Observation load reduced. Recommend continued passive monitoring via civilian infrastructure. I deleted the email, wiped my trash, powered my phone down for an hour, but the words stayed with me, especially that last part, because I finally understood what came next. They weren't done building flood control facilities, sea barriers, pump stations, or levees, and they weren't done staffing them with people like me, because the system worked best when the observers didn't know what they were really watching, when their fear and confusion and attention fed into the process naturally, without resistance. I started paying closer attention to the news after that, not the headlines but the phrasing, the way reports talked about water creeping into places it hadn't reached before, neighborhoods quietly rezoned, flood maps updated overnight like clerical corrections rather than warnings, and always the same reassurance. Infrastructure held as designed, systems responded appropriately, no cause for alarm. Every time I saw footage of a siren test, heard that hollow rising wail echoing across a town that wasn't under threat yet, my chest tightened, because I knew the difference now between a warning and an announcement. I still dream about the control room sometimes, about the monitors disagreeing with each other, about the moment the sirens stopped sounding like alarms and started speaking with intent. And in those dreams, I don't run. I stand there logging readings while the water inches closer, convincing myself I'm doing my job right up until the boundary decides it needs one more correction. I wake up drenched in sweat, listening to the pipes in my walls, counting the seconds between sounds to make sure nothing is sinking to my attention. I don't live near rivers anymore, or marshes, or low ground of any kind, and I never volunteer for night shifts. But it doesn't matter as much as I want it to, because the truth is the water doesn't need me specifically. It just needs someone to watch, to listen, to confirm that the line exists so it knows exactly where to press next. Somewhere right now, a new facility is coming online, staffed by a single overnight guard who was told it's a quiet post. Nothing ever happens, just follow the protocols and log anything unusual. And when the sirens activate without a storm, he'll freeze the same way I did, heart racing, waiting for an explanation that won't come. And the system will learn his voice, his attention, his certainty, and decide whether he's part of the structure or part of the release. The water doesn't rush anymore, it doesn't have to, because it's learned something we still refuse to accept, that boundaries aren't broken by force. They're dissolved by agreement, one quiet adjustment at a time, until the map changes and everyone pretends the new line was always there.